Margaret Thompson had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 52, she worked as a librarian at the small-town library in Millbrook, Tennessee, where she'd spent the last 15 years organizing books and helping patrons find information. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes. To most people, she was just another quiet, middle-aged woman living an unremarkable life. The trouble started when Jake Morrison moved in next door. Jake was a 35-year-old construction worker who had recently returned from what he claimed was military service overseas. He was loud, brash, and had a habit of throwing parties that lasted well into the night. But what bothered Margaret most wasn't the noise. It was the way Jake treated her and other women in the neighborhood. Jake had developed a habit of calling Margaret Paper Soldier whenever he saw her. The nickname started after he noticed her reading military history books on her front porch one evening. When she politely asked him to keep the noise down during one of his parties, Jake had laughed and said, "What would you know about real fighting, Paper Soldier? You've probably never seen anything more dangerous than a paper cut." The comment stung more than Margaret let on. She had spent years carefully constructing a quiet, peaceful life, and Jake's mockery threatened to unravel the carefully maintained boundaries she had built around her past. But she said nothing, simply nodding and retreating to her house, where she would sit by her window and watch Jake's friends come and go, their laughter echoing through the night. The situation escalated when Jake began harassing other women in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived across the street, became a frequent target of his crude jokes. When teenage Emma Rodriguez walked past his house on her way to school, Jake would make inappropriate comments that made the girl visibly uncomfortable. Margaret watched it all from her window, her jaw clenching tighter each day. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning in early September. Margaret was tending to her small garden when she heard shouting from across the street. Jake was standing in his driveway, arms crossed, blocking Mrs. Patterson's car as she tried to back out. The elderly woman looked terrified behind the wheel. "Where do you think you're going, old lady?" Jake shouted. "You called in a noise complaint last night, didn't you? Think you can just drive away without facing the consequences?" Margaret dropped her watering can and started walking toward the confrontation. As she approached, Jake noticed her and grinned maliciously. "Well, well, look who's coming to play hero," he called out. "The Paper Soldier herself. What are you going to do, bore me to death with library rules?" Margaret stopped a few feet away from Jake, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. Her voice was calm when she spoke. "Let Mrs. Patterson go, Jake. This isn't worth the trouble you're about to bring on yourself." Jake laughed loudly. "Trouble? From you? Lady, you wouldn't know real trouble if it bit you on your book-reading behind. I've seen real combat, real violence. You've probably never even held a weapon." Margaret's eyes flickered with something that Jake was too arrogant to recognize as dangerous. "Jake," she said quietly, "you need to move away from that car right now." "Or what?" Jake stepped closer, towering over Margaret's smaller frame. "What's a paper soldier like you going to do about it?" That's when Margaret slowly pushed up the sleeves of her cardigan. Margaret's right forearm was covered in small, precise scars. They weren't random or accidental. They were methodical, deliberate marks that formed a pattern Jake couldn't immediately understand. But as his eyes focused on the marks, counting them, his expression began to change from smug confidence to growing confusion, then to something approaching fear. The scars weren't just random scratches. They were tally marks, carefully carved and deliberately placed. Jake counted 12 distinct groups of 5 marks each, with 7 additional single marks. 67 total. Each mark was small, neat, and had clearly been made with surgical precision. "What the hell is that?" Jake's voice had lost its mocking tone. Margaret rolled up her left sleeve as well, revealing another set of identical marks. This arm bore 15 complete groups of 5, plus 3 individual marks, 78 more scars. Combined with her right arm, the total was 145 small, precise marks etched into her skin. "These aren't decorative, Jake," Margaret said, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made Mrs. Patterson grip her steering wheel tighter. "Each mark represents a confirmed elimination during my 15 years of active duty, mostly overseas, some domestic. I was what they call a cleaner, the person they sent when problems needed to disappear quietly." Jake's face had gone pale. "You're lying. You're a librarian." "I am a librarian," Margaret agreed. "I've been a librarian for 15 years, but before that I was Staff Sergeant Margaret Thompson, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, what civilians sometimes call Delta Force. I specialized in long-range reconnaissance and targeted elimination of high-value threats." The neighborhood had gone completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Mrs. Patterson sat frozen in her car, unable to look away from the quiet woman who had just revealed a past that nobody could have imagined. "Each of these marks," Margaret continued, pointing to her scarred arms, "represents someone who thought they were tough enough to hurt innocent people. Someone who thought their size, their aggression, their willingness to intimidate others made them untouchable. I was very good at proving them wrong." Jake took a step backward, his earlier bravado evaporating. "You can't just threaten people like that. I'll call the police." "Go ahead," Margaret said calmly. "Call them. Tell them that the quiet librarian next door told you about her military service record. Tell them about the commendations I received for protecting civilians in war zones. Tell them about the medal I got for single-handedly neutralizing a terrorist cell that was targeting women and children." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And while you're at it, tell them how you've been harassing elderly women and making inappropriate comments to teenage girls. Tell them about the noise complaints, the verbal harassment, the intimidation tactics you've been using against your neighbors." Jake's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The confidence that had defined him for months was crumbling as he realized that the woman he had been tormenting was someone he should have left alone. "I came here to live quietly," Margaret continued. "I chose this life, this job, this peaceful existence because I was tired of violence. I was tired of having to hurt people, even when they deserved it. I wanted to help people find information, organize knowledge, create order instead of chaos. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to do my old job." Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice. "Margaret, dear, I had no idea." "Nobody did," Margaret said gently, not taking her eyes off Jake. "And that's how I preferred it. I've spent 15 years building a quiet, normal life. I read books. I help people find answers to their questions. I tend my garden. I don't want to go back to being the person who made these marks." She looked down at her scarred arms, then back at Jake. "But I will if I have to." Jake was now visibly shaking. The realization that he had been bullying a trained killer for months was sinking in, and with it came the understanding of just how much danger he had unknowingly put himself in. "I think," Margaret said quietly, "that you owe Mrs. Patterson an apology, and then you need to move your car so she can go about her day." Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling over his own feet. I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Jake," Margaret's voice cut through his stammering, "the apology isn't for me. It's for Mrs. Patterson, and for Emma Rodriguez, and for every woman in this neighborhood who has had to deal with your behavior over the past 6 months." He turned toward Mrs. Patterson's car, his face red with shame and fear. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm really sorry. I was way out of line. I shouldn't have blocked your car. I shouldn't have yelled at you. I shouldn't have made those noise complaints your problem." The elderly woman nodded stiffly. "Thank you, Jake. I accept your apology." Jake moved his car out of the way, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. Mrs. Patterson backed out of her driveway and drove away, but not before giving Margaret a grateful nod. As Jake started to retreat toward his house, Margaret called out to him, "Jake, we need to finish this conversation." He stopped, his shoulders sagging. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand something," Margaret said, walking closer to him. "I don't make threats. I don't use my past to intimidate people for petty reasons. But when someone hurts innocent people, when someone uses their size and aggression to make others feel unsafe, that's when I have a problem. Jake nodded rapidly. I get it, I'll stop. I'll leave everyone alone. It's not that simple, Margaret said. You've created a pattern of behavior that has made multiple people in this neighborhood feel unsafe. Emma Rodriguez is afraid to walk past your house. Mrs. Patterson has been losing sleep because of your parties. The Johnson family has been considering moving because of your harassment. She paused, studying Jake's face. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to each of these families and apologize. Not a quick sorry and then back to your old behavior. A real apology where you acknowledge what you did wrong and commit to changing. Jake nodded again. Okay, yes, I can do that. And Margaret continued, you're going to make changes to your lifestyle. The parties can continue, but they end at 10 p.m. on weeknights and midnight on weekends. You're going to treat every woman in this neighborhood with respect. You're going to stop making inappropriate comments to teenage girls. Yes, absolutely, Jake said quickly. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Jake, I want you to understand something important. I didn't show you these scars to threaten you. I showed you them to help you understand that your actions have consequences. Every person you've been harassing, every woman you've made uncomfortable, every neighbor you've intimidated, they all have the right to feel safe in their own neighborhood. She rolled down her sleeves, covering the scars once again. I've seen what happens when people think they can hurt others without consequences. I've seen what happens when bullies think they're untouchable. It doesn't end well for them. Jake swallowed hard. I understand, I really do. I'll change, I promise. Good, Margaret said. Because if you don't, if you go back to your old behavior, if you make any of these people feel unsafe again, I won't need to do anything dramatic. I'll simply make some phone calls to people who knew me in my previous career. They'll handle the situation in ways that are much less pleasant than this conversation. The color drained from Jake's face. You don't have to do that. I'll change. I swear I'll change. Margaret nodded. I believe you will. Because despite what you might think, I don't want to hurt you, Jake. I want you to become a better person. I want you to be the kind of neighbor who makes this community stronger, not weaker. She started to walk back toward her house, then paused. One more thing, Jake. The nickname Paper Soldier stops now. If you need to address me, you can call me Margaret or Mrs. Thompson. Show some respect. Jake nodded vigorously. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Thompson. I'm sorry about that, too. Margaret walked back to her house, leaving Jake standing in his driveway, fundamentally changed by what he had just learned. As she reached her front door, she could hear him starting up his car, probably to go begin the apology tour she had assigned him. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about what had happened. By evening, Margaret had received visits from 3 different neighbors, all thanking her for finally standing up to Jake. Mrs. Patterson brought her a homemade apple pie. Emma Rodriguez's mother stopped by to express her gratitude for making her daughter feel safe walking to school again. Margaret accepted their thanks graciously, but she could see the change in how they looked at her. The quiet librarian they had known for 15 years was still there, but now they saw her through the lens of her revealed past. She had expected this, had dreaded it even, but she had decided that protecting her neighbors was more important than maintaining her carefully constructed anonymity. That night, as Margaret sat on her front porch reading a book about the Civil War, she noticed that Jake's house was completely quiet. No party, no loud music, no shouting, just peaceful silence. She allowed herself a small smile as she turned the page. The next morning brought the first real test of Jake's commitment to change. Emma Rodriguez was walking to school when she passed Jake's house. Instead of the usual inappropriate comments, Jake was outside watering his lawn. When he saw Emma approaching, he simply nodded respectfully and said, "Good morning, Emma. Have a good day at school." Emma looked surprised but pleased. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You too." Margaret watched the interaction from her window, noting the genuine effort Jake was making to be respectful. It was a small moment, but it represented a significant change in his behavior. Over the following days, Jake made good on his promise to apologize to his neighbors. He spent an hour with Mrs. Patterson, listening to her explain how his behavior had affected her and committing to being more considerate. He spoke with the Johnson family about their concerns and promised to keep his parties quieter. The most difficult conversation was with Emma Rodriguez's parents. Jake had to face the fact that his comments had made a teenage girl uncomfortable and afraid. Emma's father, Miguel, was initially hostile, but Jake's genuine remorse and commitment to change eventually won him over. "I was completely out of line," Jake told Miguel and his wife Carmen. "I made your daughter feel unsafe, and that's unacceptable. I'm going to make sure it never happens again." Miguel studied Jake's face, looking for signs of insincerity. "My daughter should be able to walk to school without worrying about some grown man making comments about her appearance." "You're absolutely right," Jake said. "I was acting like a creep and I'm ashamed of myself. I promise you I will never make Emma or any other young person feel uncomfortable again." Carmen Rodriguez had remained silent during most of the conversation, but now she spoke up. "Jake, we appreciate you coming here to apologize, but words are easy. We need to see real change in your behavior." "I understand," Jake said. "I'm going to prove to you and everyone else in this neighborhood that I can be a better person." Meanwhile, Margaret continued her daily routine of working at the library, but she noticed that people treated her differently now. Some seemed nervous around her, unsure how to interact with someone who had revealed such a dramatic past. Others treated her with a newfound respect that bordered on awe. One afternoon, while Margaret was helping a patron find information about local history, she overheard two teenagers talking quietly at a nearby table. "That's her," one whispered to the other. "That's the librarian who used to be some kind of special forces soldier." "No way," the other replied. "She looks so normal." Margaret pretended not to hear, but the conversation reminded her of the price she had paid for protecting her neighbors. Her quiet, anonymous life was over. She was no longer just the helpful librarian. She was now the mysterious former soldier who had confronted the neighborhood bully. That evening, Margaret was surprised to find Jake standing on her front porch, holding a small potted plant. "Mrs. Thompson," he said nervously, "I wanted to thank you." Margaret looked at him curiously. "Thank me for what?" "For not giving up on me," Jake said. "You could have just handled me the way you handled problems in your old job. Instead, you gave me a chance to change." Margaret accepted the plant, nodding that it was a small rose bush. "Everyone deserves a chance to become better, Jake. The question is whether they're willing to take that chance." "I am," Jake said firmly. "I've been thinking a lot about the person I was becoming, and I didn't like what I saw. I was turning into someone my own mother would be ashamed of." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of genuine change. "What made you start behaving the way you did? This isn't about excuses. I just want to understand." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I think I was angry about things that had nothing to do with anyone in this neighborhood. I got out of the military under less than ideal circumstances. I was having trouble finding steady work. I was dealing with some personal problems. I took all that anger and frustration out on people who didn't deserve it." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now I realize that my problems don't give me the right to make other people's lives miserable," Jake said. "I've started seeing a counselor to work through some of my issues. I'm trying to be the kind of person who makes things better, not worse." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's good, Jake. Real change takes time and effort. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." As Jake walked back to his house, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had revealed a part of herself that she had kept hidden for 15 years, and in doing so, she had changed not just Jake's life but her own as well. The weeks that followed brought gradual improvements to the neighborhood. Jake's parties became occasional, quiet gatherings rather than loud, disruptive events. He began volunteering at the local community center, working with at-risk youth. Emma Rodriguez no longer dreaded walking past his house, and Mrs. Patterson was sleeping better at night. Margaret found herself in an unexpected position of respect and influence in the community. People began coming to her not just for help finding books, but for advice on dealing with difficult situations. Her past, once a closely guarded secret, had become a source of wisdom and guidance for others. One evening, as Margaret was closing up the library, she was approached by a young woman named Ashley who worked at the grocery store. "Mrs. Thompson," Ashley said hesitantly, "I heard about what happened with Jake Morrison. I was wondering if I could talk to you about something." Margaret looked at the young woman with concern. "Of course, Ashley, what's troubling you?" "It's my manager at work," Ashley said. "He's been making inappropriate comments, touching me when he doesn't need to, making me feel really uncomfortable. I've tried to handle it myself, but he just keeps getting worse." Margaret felt a familiar anger building inside her. "Have you reported this to anyone?" "He's friends with the store owner," Ashley said. "I'm afraid if I complain, I'll lose my job. I need this job, Mrs. Thompson. I'm supporting my little brother since our parents died." Margaret studied Ashley's face, seeing the fear and frustration that she had witnessed in too many victims over the years. "Ashley, what your manager is doing is illegal. It's sexual harassment and you have rights." "I know, but nothing," Margaret said firmly. "You shouldn't have to choose between your safety and your job. Let me help you." Over the next few days, Margaret worked with Ashley to document the harassment and explore options for addressing it. She helped Ashley file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and connected her with a local attorney who specialized in employment law. When Ashley's manager learned about the complaint, he tried to intimidate her into withdrawing it. He cornered her in the break room one evening, towering over her and threatening to fire her if she didn't stop causing trouble. That's when Margaret arrived at the grocery store. She had come to buy her weekly groceries, but when she saw Ashley's manager, David Chen, backing the young woman into a corner, she immediately intervened. "Excuse me," Margaret said politely, "but I believe you're blocking the exit." David turned around, annoyed at the interruption. "This is a private conversation, lady. Mind your own business." "When you're intimidating a young woman in a public place, it becomes everyone's business," Margaret replied calmly. David looked Margaret up and down dismissively. "Look, Grandma, I don't know who you think you are, but this doesn't concern you. Walk away." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm Margaret Thompson. I believe Ashley has mentioned me." David's expression changed as he recognized the name. The story of Margaret's confrontation with Jake Morrison had spread throughout the small town, growing more dramatic with each retelling. "You're the librarian," David said, his voice uncertain. "Among other things," Margaret replied. "Ashley, why don't you go get your things? I'll wait here with Mr. Chen." Ashley nodded gratefully and hurried away. David found himself alone with Margaret, who continued to smile that unsettling smile. "Mr. Chen," Margaret said conversationally, "I understand you've been making Ashley's work environment uncomfortable." "That's between me and her," David said, trying to maintain his authority. "Actually, it's between you and the law," Margaret replied. "Sexual harassment is a federal crime. Creating a hostile work environment is illegal. What you've been doing to Ashley could result in serious legal consequences for both you and this store." David's face was turning red. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to prove anything," Margaret said. "The EEOC will handle that. I'm just here to make sure you understand the seriousness of your situation." She stepped closer to David, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You see, Mr. Chen, I have a particular dislike for men who use their position of authority to intimidate and harass women. It's something I've encountered many times in my previous career, and I've always found effective ways to address it." David backed away from her. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you," Margaret said. "I'm helping you understand that your behavior has consequences. Ashley has already filed a complaint with the EEOC. The investigation will begin soon. You can continue to intimidate her and make things worse for yourself, or you can start behaving like a professional." Ashley returned with her purse and jacket. "I'm ready to go, Mrs. Thompson." "Excellent," Margaret said. "Mr. Chen, I trust Ashley will be treated with the respect she deserves when she comes to work tomorrow." David nodded reluctantly. "Fine, whatever." "Good," Margaret said. "Because if she experiences any retaliation for filing her complaint, I'll be back. And next time I won't be nearly as polite." As Margaret and Ashley left the store, David remained in the break room, shaken by the encounter. He had expected to intimidate Ashley into withdrawing her complaint, but instead he had found himself face to face with someone who made him feel genuinely afraid. The next day, Ashley reported that David had been cold but professional. He didn't make any inappropriate comments, didn't touch her unnecessarily, and didn't retaliate against her for filing the complaint. Over the following weeks, the EEOC investigation proceeded smoothly. Other female employees came forward with similar stories about David's behavior. The store owner, faced with potential legal liability, decided to terminate David's employment and implement new policies to prevent sexual harassment. Ashley kept her job and was eventually promoted to a management position herself. She made sure to create the kind of workplace environment she had always wished for, one where all employees were treated with dignity and respect. Margaret's reputation in the community continued to grow. She became known not just as the quiet librarian with the mysterious past, but as someone who would stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. People began coming to her with problems that went beyond finding books: domestic violence situations, workplace harassment, neighborhood disputes. Each time, Margaret approached the situation with the same calm determination she had shown with Jake Morrison and David Chen. She never resorted to violence or even explicit threats. Instead, she used her presence, her knowledge, and her reputation to help resolve conflicts and protect the vulnerable. One particularly challenging case involved an elderly man named Harold Wright, who was being financially exploited by his nephew. The nephew, Rick Wright, had convinced Harold to sign over power of attorney and was systematically draining his uncle's bank accounts. Harold's neighbor, Mrs. Foster, brought the situation to Margaret's attention. "I'm worried about Harold," she said. "His nephew has been staying with him for months, and Harold seems confused and frightened. I think Rick is taking advantage of him." Margaret agreed to look into the situation. She visited Harold under the pretext of delivering library books, and quickly realized that the elderly man was indeed being manipulated and possibly abused. "Harold," Margaret said gently, "are you happy with the way Rick is handling your finances?" Harold looked around nervously, as if afraid Rick might overhear. "I don't really understand what's happening," he admitted. "Rick says he's helping me, but I can't seem to get access to my own money anymore." Margaret spent time with Harold, helping him understand his rights and options. She connected him with adult protective services and helped him find a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. When Rick realized that his scheme was being exposed, he tried to intimidate Harold into staying quiet. He threatened to put Harold in a nursing home if the elderly man didn't cooperate. That's when Margaret paid Rick a visit. She found him at Harold's house, loudly arguing with his uncle about some financial documents. When Margaret knocked on the door, Rick answered with an annoyed expression. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I'm here to check on Harold," Margaret said calmly. "I brought him some books from the library." "He doesn't need any books," Rick said, trying to close the door. Margaret placed her hand on the door, preventing it from closing. "I think Harold can speak for himself about what he needs." Rick tried to push the door shut, but Margaret's hand didn't budge. Despite her small stature, she was surprisingly strong. "Let me in, Rick," Margaret said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that made Rick step back involuntarily. She entered the house and found Harold sitting at the kitchen table, looking distressed and confused. Financial documents were scattered across the table, and it was clear that Rick had been pressuring his uncle to sign something. "Harold," Margaret said gently, "are you all right?" Before Harold could answer, Rick interrupted. "This is none of your business, lady. Harold and I are family. We don't need some nosy librarian interfering in our private affairs." Margaret turned to face Rick, her expression calm but intimidating. "Rick, I think you and I need to have a conversation outside." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Rick said. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm someone who doesn't tolerate elder abuse," Margaret said firmly. "I'm someone who has seen what happens to people who prey on the vulnerable. I'm someone who has the knowledge and connections to make your life very difficult if you continue down this path." Rick looked uncertain. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you a choice," Margaret said. "You can stop taking advantage of Harold, return the money you've stolen, and walk away. Or you can continue what you're doing and face the consequences." "What consequences?" Rick asked, trying to sound defiant. Margaret smiled the same unsettling smile she had used with Jake Morrison and David Chen. "Rick, I spent 15 years in military intelligence. I know how to investigate people, how to track financial crimes, how to build cases that prosecutors love. If you want to test me, I'm happy to show you exactly what I can do." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've already connected Harold with Adult Protective Services and an attorney who specializes in elder abuse. The investigation into your activities is already underway. You can cooperate and try to minimize the damage, or you can continue to fight and make things much worse for yourself." Rick's face went pale. "You can't prove anything." "Rick, you've been living in Harold's house for months, using his credit cards, accessing his bank accounts, and pressuring him to sign financial documents. The paper trail is extensive. The evidence is overwhelming. The only question is whether you want to face criminal charges or civil penalties." Harold looked up from the table, his confusion clearing for a moment. "Rick, have you been stealing from me?" Rick looked between his uncle and Margaret, realizing that his scheme was completely exposed. "Uncle Harold, I was just trying to help you manage your money." "By stealing it?" Harold asked, his voice gaining strength. "By lying to me, by making me afraid in my own home." Margaret put a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. "Harold, you don't have to be afraid anymore. Rick is going to leave now, and he's not going to bother you again." She turned back to Rick. "You have 24 hours to return every penny you've taken from Harold. After that, the attorney will file criminal charges and civil suits. The choice is yours." Rick looked around the room desperately, seeing no way out of his situation. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll pay it back, just give me some time to get the money together." 24 hours, Margaret repeated. "And Rick, if you try to intimidate Harold or pressure him in any way, I'll make sure you face the full consequences of your actions." Rick gathered his things and left the house, muttering under his breath about crazy old ladies and minding your own business. Margaret stayed with Harold for another hour, helping him understand what had happened and connecting him with resources to protect himself in the future. She also helped him change his bank account passwords and contact his credit card companies to report the unauthorized charges. The next day, Rick transferred the stolen money back to Harold's accounts and left town. Harold was able to live independently in his own home, with the support of neighbors and local services. Word of Margaret's intervention spread quickly through the community. People began to see her as more than just a librarian with an interesting past. She was becoming a protector, someone who would stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But Margaret's growing reputation also brought unwanted attention. Local law enforcement began taking notice of her activities, and some officers were concerned about a civilian taking on roles that typically fell to police. Detective Sarah Martinez approached Margaret one afternoon as she was leaving the library. "Mrs. Thompson, I was hoping we could have a conversation about some of the situations you've been involved in lately." Margaret looked at the detective calmly. "Of course, Detective Martinez. What can I help you with?" "Well, there have been reports of you intervening in various disputes around town. While I appreciate your desire to help people, I'm concerned that you might be putting yourself and others at risk." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concern, Detective, but I'm curious. Have any of the people I've helped filed complaints about my actions?" "Well, no," Detective Martinez admitted. "In fact, most of them have expressed gratitude for your help, but some of the people you've confronted have suggested that you've been intimidating or threatening them." "I see," Margaret said. "And what specific laws do they claim I've broken?" Detective Martinez looked uncomfortable. "That's the thing. Technically, you haven't broken any laws. You've been careful to stay within legal boundaries. But there's a concern that you're using your reputation and past military service to intimidate people." Margaret smiled. "Detective, I spent 15 years in the military learning how to handle threats and protect innocent people. I'm now using those skills to help my community in a completely legal way. I don't make threats. I educate people about the consequences of their actions." "But your presence alone can be intimidating," Detective Martinez pointed out. "So can a police officer's presence," Margaret replied. "The difference is that I'm not carrying a weapon, I'm not making arrests, and I'm not using any official authority. I'm simply a concerned citizen who happens to have experience dealing with difficult situations." Detective Martinez studied Margaret's face, looking for any sign of deception or hostility. "Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, are you carrying any weapons?" Margaret shook her head. "No, Detective. I haven't carried a weapon since I left the military 15 years ago. I don't need to. The situations I've been dealing with don't require violence. They require understanding, persistence, and sometimes just the presence of someone who won't be intimidated. And if someone decides to escalate a situation, if someone becomes violent, Margaret's expression became serious. Then I'll defend myself and anyone else who needs protecting, using whatever level of force is necessary and legal. But I'll also call the police immediately, because that's what responsible citizens do. Detective Martinez nodded slowly. I can respect that, but I want you to understand that if you ever cross the line into vigilante justice, if you ever use violence or make actual threats, I'll have to take action. I understand completely, Margaret said, and I hope you understand that I'm not trying to replace law enforcement. I'm trying to help people who fall through the cracks, who need someone to stand up for them before situations escalate to the point where police involvement becomes necessary. The detective extended her hand. Mrs. Thompson, I think we understand each other. I hope you'll continue to work within the system and call us if you encounter any situations that require official intervention. Margaret shook the detective's hand. Of course, Detective Martinez, I want to help make this community safer for everyone. As the detective walked away, Margaret reflected on the conversation. She understood the concerns about her activities, but she also knew that she was making a real difference in people's lives. The key was to continue operating within legal boundaries while still being effective in helping those who needed protection. The next few months brought new challenges and opportunities for Margaret to help her community. She mediated a dispute between neighbors over property lines, helped a single mother deal with a stalker ex-boyfriend, and assisted an elderly couple who were being scammed by fake charity organizations. Each situation required different approaches, but Margaret's method remained consistent. She would gather information, understand the dynamics of the situation, and then use her presence and reputation to create consequences for those who were causing harm. Her most challenging case came when she was approached by a group of high school students who were being bullied by older teenagers from a neighboring town. The bullies had been targeting students based on their race and economic status, and the situation was escalating toward violence. Mrs. Thompson, said Jessica Kim, a 16-year-old student, we've tried talking to teachers, we've tried talking to parents, but these guys just keep getting worse. They're talking about bringing weapons to school. We're scared. Margaret listened carefully to the students' concerns, taking notes about the specific incidents and the escalating nature of the threats. The bullies were led by a 19-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had dropped out of school but continued to hang around targeting younger students. He had assembled a group of followers who enjoyed intimidating kids they perceived as different or vulnerable. Have you reported this to the police? Margaret asked. "We tried," said another student, David Park. "But they said since no actual violence has occurred yet, and since most of the harassment is happening off school property, there's not much they can do." Margaret nodded, understanding the limitations of official intervention. "What about school administrators?" "They're worried about liability," Jessica explained. "They don't want to get involved in something that might lead to violence. They told us to avoid the areas where these guys hang out." Margaret felt the familiar anger building inside her. The system was failing these young people, leaving them vulnerable to escalating threats from older, more aggressive bullies. It was exactly the kind of situation she had encountered too many times in her previous life. "Tell me everything you know about Marcus Webb and his group," Margaret said. "Where they hang out, what they do for work, who their friends and family are. I need to understand who I'm dealing with." Over the next few days, Margaret conducted her own investigation into Marcus Webb and his associates. She discovered that Marcus had a history of minor legal troubles, assault charges that were dropped, harassment complaints that were dismissed, a pattern of behavior that suggested he was comfortable using intimidation and threats to get what he wanted. Margaret also learned that Marcus worked part-time at a local auto repair shop owned by his uncle. He lived with his mother in a trailer park outside of town and had been struggling with substance abuse issues. His followers were mostly unemployed young men who looked up to him as a leader. The information painted a picture of a young man who was using aggression and bullying to compensate for his own failures and insecurities. Margaret recognized the type. She had encountered similar personalities in various conflict zones throughout her military career. Margaret decided to approach Marcus directly, but she knew she needed to be careful. Unlike her previous confrontations with Jake Morrison and David Chen, this situation involved someone who was younger, more volatile, and potentially more dangerous. She found Marcus at the auto repair shop on a Thursday afternoon, working on an old pickup truck. When she approached him, he looked up with suspicion. "You looking for someone?" Marcus asked, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "I'm looking for Marcus Webb," Margaret said calmly. "That's me. What do you want?" Margaret studied the young man carefully. He was tall and muscular, with tattoos covering his arms and a hostile expression that suggested he was used to intimidating people. But she also saw something else, a defensiveness that spoke to deeper insecurities. "I want to talk to you about your interactions with some high school students," Margaret said. Marcus's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Margaret replied. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been harassing Jessica Kim, David Park, and several other students. You've been making threats about bringing weapons to their school." Marcus straightened up, trying to use his height to intimidate Margaret. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but you need to mind your own business." "My name is Margaret Thompson," she said, watching for his reaction. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. Even he had heard the stories about the librarian who had confronted Jake Morrison and several other troublemakers around town. "So you're the crazy military lady everyone's been talking about," Marcus said, trying to sound dismissive. "I'm the person who helps when young people are being threatened by cowards who pick on kids instead of dealing with their own problems," Margaret replied evenly. Marcus's face flushed with anger. "You calling me a coward?" "I'm calling you someone who targets high school students because they're easier to intimidate than people your own age," Margaret said. "I'm calling you someone who threatens violence against kids because it makes you feel powerful." Marcus stepped closer to Margaret, his hands clenched into fists. "You better watch your mouth, old lady." Margaret didn't step back. Instead, she looked up at Marcus with the same calm expression she had used with every other bully she had confronted. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing right now. You're threatening a 52-year-old woman in broad daylight at your place of employment. There are witnesses. There are probably security cameras. You're about to make a very stupid mistake." Marcus looked around, suddenly aware that other mechanics were watching the confrontation. His uncle, the shop owner, was standing in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Marcus," his uncle called out, "what's going on over there?" Margaret turned toward the shop owner. "Mr. Webb, I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm here to discuss your nephew's harassment of high school students." The shop owner's face went pale. "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Marcus looked between his uncle and Margaret, realizing that his workplace was not the best location for this confrontation. "It's nothing, Uncle Pete. Just some misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," Margaret said firmly. "Marcus has been terrorizing local students with threats of violence. He's been targeting them based on their race and economic status. The situation is escalating, and I'm here to make sure it stops before someone gets hurt." Uncle Pete walked over to where Margaret and Marcus were standing. "Marcus, is this true?" "It's not what she's making it sound like," Marcus said defensively. "Those kids are just soft. They can't handle a little teasing." "Teasing." Margaret's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You call threatening to bring weapons to school teasing. You call racial slurs and harassment teasing." Uncle Pete's expression darkened. "Marcus, you've been making threats about weapons." "I wasn't serious," Marcus said quickly. "I was just trying to scare them a little." "Just trying to scare them," Margaret repeated. "Marcus, do you understand that threatening violence against students is a federal crime? Do you understand that what you're doing could be classified as domestic terrorism? Marcus's face went white. Domestic terrorism, that's ridiculous. Is it? Margaret asked. You're using threats of violence to intimidate students based on their race and economic status. You're trying to create fear and control behavior through intimidation. That's textbook terrorism, Marcus. Uncle Pete stepped between Margaret and Marcus. Ma'am, I apologize for my nephew's behavior. I had no idea he was involved in anything like this. Mr. Webb, Margaret said, I don't hold you responsible for Marcus's actions, but I do need to know that this situation is going to be resolved immediately. She turned back to Marcus. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. You're going to leave those students alone completely. No more following them, no more threats, no more harassment. You're going to find better ways to spend your time than terrorizing children. And if I don't? Marcus asked, trying to maintain some semblance of defiance. Margaret smiled her unsettling smile. Then I'll make sure you face the full consequences of your actions. I'll document every threat you've made, every incident of harassment, every violation of these students' civil rights. I'll present that information to federal authorities who take domestic terrorism very seriously. She paused, letting her words sink in. Marcus, I've spent 15 years tracking down people who use violence and intimidation to hurt innocent people. I'm very good at building cases that prosecutors love. I'm very good at making sure that bullies face consequences for their actions. Marcus looked around desperately, seeing no support from his uncle or coworkers. You can't prove anything. I can prove everything, Margaret said calmly. I have witness statements. I have documentation of your threats. I have evidence of your pattern of harassment. What I don't have is patience for people who threaten children. Uncle Pete put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Son, I think you need to apologize to this lady and promise her that you'll leave those students alone. Marcus looked at his uncle, then back at Margaret. The defiance was slowly draining from his expression as he realized the seriousness of his situation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Marcus, Margaret said, I don't want your apology. I want your commitment to change. I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you but for the young people you've been terrorizing. She studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding. Those students you've been harassing, they're just kids trying to get an education. They're not your enemies. They're not responsible for whatever problems you're dealing with in your own life. Marcus nodded slowly. I understand. I'll leave them alone. Good, Margaret said. Because if you don't, if you continue to threaten or harass any student, I'll make sure you face criminal charges. And Marcus, Next time you might not be dealing with a polite librarian. You might be dealing with federal agents who don't have my patience. As Margaret walked away from the auto repair shop, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She had successfully confronted another bully, but she was also aware that the situations she was dealing with were becoming more complex and potentially dangerous. That evening, Margaret received a call from Jessica Kim. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to thank you. Marcus and his friends haven't bothered us all week." "I'm glad to hear that, Jessica," Margaret said. "But I want you to promise me that you'll report any future incidents immediately. Don't wait for things to escalate." "We will," Jessica promised. "And Mrs. Thompson, thank you for believing us. Thank you for taking us seriously when the adults were telling us to just ignore it." After the call, Margaret sat in her living room, reflecting on the path her life had taken. She had come to Millbrook seeking peace and anonymity, but she had found herself becoming a protector and advocate for those who needed help. The next few months passed quietly. Marcus Webb kept his word and left the students alone. Jake Morrison continued to be a respectful neighbor. David Chen had been replaced by a manager who treated all employees fairly. Harold Wright was living safely in his own home, protected from financial exploitation. But Margaret's growing reputation as someone who could solve problems was attracting attention from beyond her small community. People from neighboring towns began seeking her help with their own difficult situations. One particularly challenging case involved a woman named Linda Carter who was being stalked by her ex-husband. Linda had moved to Millbrook to escape her abusive marriage, but her ex-husband, Robert Carter, had tracked her down and was making her life miserable. "Mrs. Thompson," Linda said during their first meeting, "I've tried everything. I have a restraining order. I've called the police dozens of times. I've moved 3 times in the past year. But Robert always finds me. He always finds a way to make me afraid." Margaret listened carefully to Linda's story, taking notes about the specific incidents and the pattern of stalking behavior. Robert Carter was a wealthy businessman who had connections in law enforcement and the legal system. He had been using his resources to track Linda and evade the consequences of his actions. "The police keep telling me there's nothing they can do unless he actually hurts me," Linda continued. "But I'm terrified that by the time he actually hurts me, it will be too late." Margaret understood Linda's frustration. She had encountered similar situations during her military career, where bureaucratic limitations prevented effective intervention in dangerous situations. "Linda," Margaret said, "I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We're going to find a way to keep you safe." Over the next few days, Margaret conducted a thorough investigation into Robert Carter's activities. She discovered that he had been using private investigators to track Linda, that he had been bribing local officials for information, and that he had a history of domestic violence that had been covered up by expensive lawyers. Margaret also learned that Robert had been making threats against Linda's family members, trying to use them as leverage to force her to return to him. The situation was more complex and dangerous than Margaret had initially realized. Margaret decided that Robert Carter required a different approach than her previous confrontations. This wasn't a case of educating a bully about consequences. This was a case of dealing with a dangerous predator who had the resources and connections to avoid traditional law enforcement. Margaret arranged to meet Robert at his office in the next town over. When she arrived, Robert's secretary tried to turn her away, but Margaret insisted on seeing him. "Mr. Carter," Margaret said when she was finally admitted to his office, "I'm here to discuss your harassment of Linda Carter." Robert looked up from his desk with an expression of mild annoyance. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm someone who helps people deal with situations that fall outside normal legal channels." Robert studied Margaret with calculating eyes. "Ah, you're the mysterious librarian everyone's been talking about. The one with the alleged military background." "Not alleged," Margaret corrected. "Documented. 15 years of active duty, specializing in intelligence gathering and threat elimination." Robert leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed. "And you're here to threaten me?" "I'm here to offer you a choice," Margaret said. "You can stop harassing Linda immediately, or you can face consequences that will be much more serious than anything you've experienced so far." Robert laughed dismissively. "Lady, I don't know what kind of small-town bullies you're used to dealing with, but I'm not some high school dropout who's going to be intimidated by your war stories." Margaret nodded calmly. "You're right, Robert. You're not a small-town bully. You're something much worse. You're a predator who uses wealth and connections to avoid consequences for your actions." She opened a folder and placed several documents on Robert's desk. "These are copies of court records from your previous relationships. 3 restraining orders, 2 assault charges that were dropped, 5 different women who have accused you of stalking and harassment." Robert's confident expression began to waver as he looked at the documents. "Where did you get these?" "I told you, Robert. I specialize in intelligence gathering. I'm very good at finding information that people think they've buried." Margaret placed additional documents on the desk. "These are financial records showing payments to private investigators, bribes to local officials, and money paid to previous victims. This is documentation of a pattern of behavior that goes back more than a decade." Robert's face was turning pale. "You can't use any of this. Most of it would be inadmissible in court. You're right, Margaret agreed. Much of this information couldn't be used in a traditional legal proceeding, but I'm not planning to take you to court, Robert. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. I'm planning to make this information available to people who don't operate within the constraints of the legal system. Journalists, federal investigators, congressional committees that investigate corruption in local law enforcement. Robert stood up abruptly. You're blackmailing me. I'm giving you information, Margaret said calmly. I'm helping you understand the consequences of your actions. What you do with that information is up to you. She gathered the documents back into the folder. Robert, I've spent 15 years dealing with men like you. Men who think their wealth and connections make them untouchable. Men who use their power to hurt innocent people. Margaret stood up, placing the folder under her arm. The difference between you and the other predators I've dealt with is that they were in war zones, where the rules were different. You're in a civilized society, where there are supposed to be consequences for your actions. She walked toward the door, then paused. Linda Carter is under my protection now, Robert. If you continue to harass her, if you make any attempt to contact her or her family, if you try to track her down or intimidate her in any way, I will make sure that every piece of information in this folder becomes public knowledge. Robert found his voice. You can't do that. I have lawyers. I have connections. Margaret smiled. Robert, your lawyers can't help you with what I'm planning to do. Your connections won't protect you from the kind of exposure I can arrange. I've spent 15 years learning how to destroy people who think they're untouchable. She opened the door. You have 24 hours to call off your private investigators and stop all harassment of Linda Carter. After that, I start making phone calls to very unpleasant people. As Margaret left Robert's office, she felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. She had successfully confronted another predator. But she was also aware that Robert Carter represented a different level of threat than her previous adversaries. The next day, Linda called Margaret with good news. Mrs. Thompson, the private investigator who's been following me, just called. He said he's been taken off the case. Robert's lawyer called and said all surveillance activities have been terminated. That's excellent news, Linda, Margaret said. But I want you to remain vigilant. Men like Robert don't give up easily. I understand, Linda said. But for the first time in months, I actually feel safe. Over the following weeks, Robert Carter kept his word. He made no attempts to contact Linda or track her down. The harassment stopped completely, and Linda was able to begin rebuilding her life in peace. Margaret's success in dealing with Robert Carter further enhanced her reputation as someone who could handle situations that were beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. People began coming to her with increasingly complex problems that required creative solutions. One such case involved a group of elderly residents at a local nursing home who were being financially exploited by the facility's administrator. The administrator, Patricia Williams, had been overcharging residents for services, billing their insurance for procedures that were never performed, and pressuring vulnerable seniors to sign over their assets to the facility. Margaret investigated the situation thoroughly, working with family members of the affected residents to document the abuse. She discovered that Patricia Williams had been running similar scams at previous facilities, always managing to avoid serious consequences by targeting victims who were too vulnerable to fight back effectively. Margaret arranged a meeting with Patricia Williams at the nursing home. When she arrived, Patricia greeted her with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand you have some concerns about our facility," Patricia said. "I have concerns about your business practices," Margaret replied. "I have documentation of financial exploitation, insurance fraud, and elder abuse." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. We run a very professional operation here." Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Patricia, I have records of overcharging, false billing, and coerced asset transfers. I have witness statements from family members and former employees. I have evidence of a pattern of exploitation that spans multiple facilities." Patricia's professional demeanor was cracking. "Even if some of those allegations were true, which they're not, there's nothing you can do about it. We have excellent lawyers and full regulatory compliance." "Patricia," Margaret said calmly, "I've dealt with people like you before. People who prey on the vulnerable and hide behind legal technicalities. The thing is, I don't operate within the same constraints as regulatory agencies." She placed several documents on Patricia's desk. "These are copies of everything I've discovered about your activities. Financial records, witness statements, evidence of systematic exploitation. I'm going to make sure this information reaches the appropriate authorities." Patricia looked at the documents with growing alarm. "You can't prove anything criminal." "I can prove everything criminal," Margaret said. "Insurance fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation. These are serious federal crimes. The FBI takes these cases very seriously, especially when they involve systematic targeting of vulnerable populations." Margaret gathered the documents back into her folder. "Patricia, you have two choices. You can resign from this position immediately and cooperate with the investigation, or you can try to fight it and face the full consequences of your actions." Patricia stared at Margaret with undisguised hatred. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I have a very good idea, Margaret replied. I'm dealing with a predator who exploits elderly people for financial gain. I'm dealing with someone who has no conscience and no empathy for the people she hurts. Margaret stood up to leave. Patricia, I've spent 15 years dealing with people who hurt innocent victims. I've never met one who didn't eventually face consequences for their actions. Within a week, Patricia Williams had resigned from her position at the nursing home. A federal investigation was launched into her activities, and several of her victims were able to recover their stolen assets. The nursing home implemented new policies to prevent future exploitation. As Margaret's reputation continued to grow, she began to attract attention from law enforcement agencies beyond her local community. FBI agents visited her to discuss her methods and to ensure that she was operating within legal boundaries. Special Agent Michael Rodriguez met with Margaret at the library one afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to discuss your recent activities with certain individuals in the community." Margaret looked at the agent calmly. "I'm happy to discuss my activities, Agent Rodriguez. What would you like to know?" "We've received reports that you've been using intimidation tactics to resolve disputes," Agent Rodriguez said. "Some of the people you've confronted have suggested that you've made threats." "I don't make threats," Margaret replied. "I provide information about the consequences of people's actions. I help them understand the legal and social repercussions of their behavior." Agent Rodriguez studied Margaret carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed your military record. Your service was exemplary and your skills are impressive. But I need to make sure you understand that civilian law enforcement operates differently than military operations." "I understand that completely," Margaret said. "I've been very careful to operate within legal boundaries. I don't carry weapons, I don't use violence, and I don't make actual threats. I simply use my knowledge and experience to help people resolve difficult situations." "And your methods have been effective," Agent Rodriguez acknowledged. "The people you've helped have expressed gratitude for your assistance, but some of the people you've confronted have filed complaints." Margaret nodded. "I would expect that. People who are used to getting away with harmful behavior don't like being held accountable for their actions." Agent Rodriguez smiled slightly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you. The Bureau has been watching your activities, and we're impressed with your results. You've resolved several situations that were causing significant problems for local law enforcement." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're not here to discourage your activities. We're here to make sure you continue to operate within legal boundaries and to offer you some resources that might be helpful." Margaret looked surprised. "What kind of resources?" "Information sharing, consultation on complex cases, access to federal databases for background checks, things that might help you be even more effective in helping your community. Agent Rodriguez handed Margaret a business card. "Mrs. Thompson, people like you are rare. People with your skills and experience who are willing to help others without expecting anything in return. We'd like to support your efforts in whatever way we can." As Agent Rodriguez left the library, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had started as a quiet librarian seeking anonymity, but she had become a community protector with the support of federal law enforcement. The months that followed brought new challenges and opportunities. Margaret continued to help people resolve difficult situations, but now she had access to resources that made her even more effective. She could conduct thorough background checks, access federal databases, and consult with experienced investigators. Her most complex case came when she was approached by a group of migrant workers who were being exploited by their employer. The workers were being forced to live in substandard conditions. Their pay was being withheld, and they were being threatened with deportation if they complained. Margaret worked with federal agents to build a case against the employer, documenting the labor violations and human trafficking elements of the situation. The case resulted in criminal charges against the employer and protection for the workers. As Margaret's story spread beyond her small community, she began receiving requests for help from people across the country. She had become a symbol of someone who would stand up for the vulnerable and hold predators accountable for their actions. But Margaret remained grounded in her original mission. She continued to work at the library, helping patrons find information and organize knowledge. She continued to live quietly in her small house, tending her garden and reading her books. The scars on her arms were no longer hidden secrets. They had become symbols of her commitment to protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. She had successfully transformed from a quiet librarian into a community protector, using her skills and experience to make the world a little bit safer for those who needed protection. Margaret Thompson had found her purpose, and in doing so, she had shown that even the most unlikely heroes can make a profound difference in the lives of others. Her story had become one of redemption, transformation, and the power of standing up for what is right, no matter the personal cost. The woman who had once been called a paper soldier had proven that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict violence, but from the willingness to protect others and hold wrongdoers accountable for their actions. In a world where bullies and predators often seem to escape consequences, Margaret Thompson had become living proof that justice could still prevail when someone with the right skills and determination decided to make a stand.